everybody, and welcome back to U.S. History. This is our first section of notes for Unit 7 on the Cold War. We'll be doing 2 sections today. So go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. Once the screen decides to load. Alright, so by post-World War II, following the end of the war, 2 superpowers emerged. Us and the Soviet Union. We were the leading superpower. Due to our home front not being affected by the war, a booming economy, being the victor, and being a major military power. The Soviet Union was a close second. Their home front was very much destroyed by the war. They suffered over 20 million in casualties, but they still had a really strong military presence. Almost immediately, the U.S. and the Soviet Union became enemies, the U.S. being led by President Truman, representing democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union being represented by Joseph Stalin in totalitarianism and communism. So let's do some definitions. So, one click too many. Democracy is a government by the people, a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in the people, and exercised by elected officials under a free electoral system. Things like opposing political parties, checks and balances, and freedom. And capitalism is an economic system in which the investment and ownership of the economy is held primarily by private individuals and corporations, with the idea of a free market with limited government involvement and competition among businesses, and an incentive for success. On the flip side, totalitarian governments are a government system pertaining to a centralized government that does not tolerate parties of differing opinion and that exercises dictatorial control over all aspects of life, where you see things like no freedom, no elected officials, and one leader having all the power, as well as no checks and balances as well. In that same vein, communism is a government and economic system based on the holding of all property in common, where actual ownership is given to the state. Now, there's usually little to no freedom with this. It's 100% government controlled. There's no incentive to succeed whatsoever. And there's also no competition in the free market to work with. So the roots of the Cold War, and we got a few that we need to go over. Well, first off, we have completely different government and economic systems in comparison to each other. Now, on top of this, we both had very different goals when it came to the post-war world, and there was much distrust that existed between the two countries. We really didn't trust each other whatsoever, even though we had been allies during the war. So our post-war goals, we'll start with the U.S. side of things and then go from there. Now, we were very peaceful and stable. We wanted the world to basically relax. And we wanted to provide self-determination for the peoples of Eastern Europe, the determining by the people of the form their government shall have, without reference to the wishes of any other nation, especially by people of a territory or former colony. And we wanted to rebuild the world in our own image, with freedom, democracy, and capitalism. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, simply wanted to rebuild their country and have revenge against Germany, and they had a desire for security, as well as to isolate Soviet people from the West through a series of satellite nations and the Iron Curtain, which we'll talk about in a minute. These countries here on this map are the satellite countries, and then the red line is the Iron Curtain. So there was a lot of distrust between democracy and communism. Now, Stalin's reputation was well known. He ruled with terror and brutality and killed millions of civilians. And the U.S. was not happy that Stalin had originally been an ally with Hitler. And Stalin was not happy with us because it took so long to launch a second front against Germany. We talked about that when we went over the North Africa campaigns. Excuse me. So that's it for the first section we're doing. But now let's start the second section that we were going to do today. So, foreign policy, by definition, is a policy pursued by a nation in its dealings with other nations designed to achieve national objectives. Our national policy towards the Soviet Union, which was designed to meet our national goals after the end of World War II, with the U.S. now being a superpower and having a global influence. So at the Yalta Conference in 1945, it was a meeting, and we talked about this briefly when we did our wrap-up for World War II. It was a meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 1945 before the end of the war. The outcome from this, being the post-war Germany would be divided into occupation zones controlled by the three Allied countries, East Germany being controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany being controlled by the U.S. and Great Britain, with Berlin, although it being located in East Germany, would be divided into East and West. And here's what that occupation zones looked like. We also have the Potsdam Conference of 1945, a later meeting between Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, with the outcome being the Soviet Union would allow free elections and self-determination in Poland and other Eastern European countries as a result of the peace efforts after the war. Now, Eastern Europe in 1946, Stalin did not keep his promise, and the Red Army occupying many of these Eastern European countries and Stalin had a tremendous influence. They didn't leave. And Stalin established satellite nations or countries dominated by the Soviet Union, including this list down below, including places like Hungary, Romania, and Poland. This map here. Now, Europe was then divided into two main political regions. We have the free democratic Western Europe and the communist Eastern Europe, with Stalin saying communism and democracy were incompatible. Now, it went on to say in a famous speech from Winston Churchill, he declared an iron curtain had descended across the continent. This was a reference to a buffer zone of communist satellite countries that provided a barrier between the democratic Western Europe and the communist Soviet Union. While we still say that those countries were a part of the Soviet Union, technically speaking, they were still their own countries, but since they were satellite countries, they were still also technically part of the Soviet Union. Again, a reference to that map for you. Now, some of our post-war goals. For the Soviet Union, create that buffer zone to protect themselves from further German invasions. Mission accomplished. The U.S. wanted to create a stable and peaceful world and rebuild the world in our own image with freedom and democracy. We also, it's important to know we had a large economic reason for wanting a democratic world because we were doing so well economically by the end of the war. It brought about an economic boom. We wanted free trade, and we wanted to be able to sell our goods and wanted access to those raw materials in Eastern Europe and do business with them. So we were like, well, what are we going to do? What is our foreign policy going to be? Now, George F. Kennan, our U.S. diplomat to Moscow, sent a long telegram to Truman and proposed a policy of containment. According to Kennan, the Soviet Union was an expansionist threat. They would move in wherever there was economic or political weakness, and that the U.S. needed to prevent Soviets from expanding their influence over weak countries. So this policy became our official foreign policy. We provided diplomatic and financial aid to weak countries. Military aid was a last resort, and a long-term patient policy to shut down Soviet expansion. This policy would drive our international involvement until the end of the Cold War. And with it, the next year, we have the Truman Doctrine, after the Soviet Union was trying to extend communism into Turkey and Greece. Truman said it must be the policy of the U.S. to extend aid to free peoples everywhere who are resisting communist rule. We then gave $400 million to Turkey and Greece to help prevent the spread of communism there. So George Marshall, our Secretary of State, proposed a plan to aid all European countries to help them rebuild, and after the devastation of the war. Stable countries are much less likely to succumb to communist takeover if they have enough time to get back on their feet. So 16 countries overall received $13 billion in aid, and by 1952, Western Europe was flourishing again, and the communist appeal was crushed. But the Soviet Union and their satellite countries refused U.S. aid altogether. So this leads to the establishment of NATO in 1949, With the Soviet Union being the most powerful military in the world, the U.S. and our allies demobilized since the end of the war, but the Soviet Union did not. There was a lot of fear of a Soviet attack. So they formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a group of countries united under military command, and an attack on one member would be viewed as an attack on all. These members were committed troops and money to bolster these defenses, just in case of a Soviet attack. NATO still exists today and is still used from time to time. So, the NSC 68, or the National Security Act of 1947, established the National Security Council and the interest of national security. It also created the CIA, and they were interested in the national security. They coordinated with the President, Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and all branches of the military. And they strengthened the military and advised the President on matters of national security. And then here's our last slide of notes for today. So NSC 68 was a very important Cold War document that documented massive military buildup and that we should be ready for war with the Soviets at all times in a constant state of alert, with a dramatic increase in military spending. So now the stage is set for the Cold War. So your assignment for today is a reading on President Truman that'll be posted on Google Classroom. See y'all next time. Bye, everyone.